Hello and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. I hope you are all well and that you are staying cool. But if you're watching this on demand and it's raining, then please do remember those lovely couple of days we had in June. I'm Emma O'Connor, partner in our employment team here at Doyle, Clayton, and head of client training. Now, as you know, if you are regular attendees at Webinar Wednesday, we like to bring you what I like to call law with a twist, and different voices and different topics and things that maybe you haven't thought about, or interesting concepts that you want to bring into your own practices and into your own businesses. And today is no exception, where we are talking about managing redundancies and making redundancies, but really thinking about compliance and, more importantly, about the communication aspects around making redundancies. And I am not flying solo today. I am thrilled to be joined by two very special guests. So I'm joined by Harry Parker. Harry, welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Hello, thank you, Emma. I'm pleased to be part of this discussion. I am an employment partner at Doyle Clayton's Bristol office, and I regularly advise on redundancy. So very keen to have Phil's perspective on this.
Absolutely. And Phil Lane, who is partner of people and culture at Miles Advisory. And Phil, thank you for joining me and welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
Thank you, Emma. It's really nice to be here. Really interesting debate, and also just really nice to bring two worlds together of legal and comms, because I think that's when things will work better. So looking forward to this session.
Absolutely. Law with a twist in action. Before we get to the main event, just a heads up for all of our clients and attendees on today's webinar who work in the regulatory sectors, so banking, finance, insurance. There are some changes afoot when it comes to non-financial misconduct that are coming into force from the 1st of September of this year, as if there wasn't enough going on at the moment, obviously. To help clients stay up to date and give you some tips and some applications that you need to be thinking about within your own organisations, then myself and my regulatory partner, Benedict Perrone, are running a training course, an open course on the 1st of July. So do book on and join us for that. It's a virtual course. So again, access to wherever you may sit. So again, please do look out for invites for that. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Next Wednesday's Webinar Wednesday will be in July before we have a little break for the summer, and that will be a joint webinar between myself and Stephen Hall, my immigration partner, where we will be bringing you a summer roundup. And there has been an awful lot going on, not just in employment law, but also in immigration as well. And if that wasn't enough, DC Talks is our podcast series where we take a deeper dive into a legal, leadership, or an HR hot topic. So again, please do subscribe to that wherever you get your podcasts from. And June's podcast is me talking about how we can manage flexible working requests. So do check that out. Bit of housekeeping. We are live as ever, but again, we are a webinar. We are not giving you legal advice. So if you want to find out more about how we can support you, how Doyle Clayton can support with your restructuring, your HR advice, or your redundancy projects, then again, do please get in touch. And I'll be sending out information after the webinar about how you can do that, as well as how you can contact Phil to find out more about how he can support your business as well. If you want to ask any questions, then please do pop those in the chat. We'll see how the time goes, but we will endeavour to come back to you after the webinar. Also, just to say, we're not doing a deep dive into redundancy process, because that would be a whole day's course in itself. But what we really want to do is focus on communication and the legal impact that the obligations we have to follow when it comes to collective and individual redundancy consultation processes, how that impacts upon communication. So Phil, let's kick off with you, if I may. And I think what will be really helpful to our audience is to listen about what you do, how you do it, and who you do it for, please.
Yeah, thank you. So so I'm Phil Lane. I'm a partner in people and culture at Miles Advisory, and we're a boutique firm. We operate out of Bristol, London, and Leeds, and we work with leaders. So a lot of what we do is executive search and placement, but our sort of our little soups on of additional goodness, if you like, is we try to help leaders land and then succeed. So that's where I come in. I do a lot of work with people on landing strategy comms within their organization and externally, lots of people comms, culture, everything around purpose, vision, values, and that kind of thing. In other words, rather than placing leaders into businesses, we also want to help them create the conditions that allow both them to thrive within that organization, but also, of course, to allow that organization to thrive itself. So we do a lot of work around C-suite, and my job is usually to work with CPOs, HRDs on things like landing the strategy, getting people motivated, all that good stuff around employee engagement. And so, of course, when you're going through something like redundancies and there's a trust gap, or there's a bit of a challenge in how people are feeling and how engaged they're feeling, I always try to connect the lack of engagement to business direction and what the business is trying to achieve. So we don't come at this from a very cold commercial angle, and we don't come at this from a purely it's all about feelings angle, but somewhere in the middle, how your people feel about what you're doing as an organization is a really important thing to focus on, and that's where we like to play.
So let's kick off with that, and let's talk about the forgotten audience. Phil, who's the forgotten audience?
Yeah, so, and this is a interesting topic for me, having been through a number of these processes with clients, and also on both sides of it, both in a management team that's gone through this, and also I've been through a number of redundancy programs over the last 25 or so years, because it happens. And I think that when organizations go through a redundancy program, a lot of the attention, quite rightly, is on the people who are leaving. There's a legal process to follow, consultations to manage, individual conversations to have, and we'll touch on that later. But as a result, the employees who receive the majority of the communication, support, and attention are those who might be leaving the organization. And as a consequence, there's a real risk of overlooking the people who are going to stay. And that's a mistake, because those people will be the ones who determine whether the organization succeeds afterwards. They're the ones who need to understand the future vision, direction, strategy. They need to remain committed, and they need to help deliver it. So, these are the people who, after a process of this kind, will still be leading your teams and serving your customers and maintaining performance rebuilding momentum once it's over. So I would advocate that, if not the most important audience in a redundancy program, they do tend to be the ones who get forgotten, and that can have real consequences.
I think that's a really good point, and I think we spend a lot of time, don't we, thinking about the offboarding, because as we know, how we offboard employees is incredibly important. We want that to be as positive an experience as we can, because who knows what might happen in the future. People may return to us. So I absolutely agree with you. I think whilst we're all kind of focusing on process, which obviously Harry and I will talk about in a moment, I think you're right. I think we forget that actually we want these people to feel engaged, feel motivated. We want them to stay because we want them to drive this organization forward.
No, completely. And actually, if we move forwards, then you'll see that we're trying to control a lot of stuff as we go through this kind of a process. We call it a process. It suggests that we're in control, but we're not. So, what happens to your organization as you start a redundancy program is, a number of things. And whether you think a particular team is affected or not, some teams are ring fenced and they're safe, but it doesn't actually mean that they're not in any way affected or responding to what's going on. So, people start asking questions about the business and the future. They wonder, is this the only round? That's a very important question, especially if they're more experienced, they've been through these things before. and they want to know what the organization will look like at the end of this, and their place in it. And I think a really significant thing for everyone to know is that a significant proportion of your people, especially the ones that, I know you can't say we don't want these ones to leave, but a significant proportion of the good people that you're going to need for the future will immediately start looking for opportunities elsewhere. The number that Gartner puts on this is 60% of employees say that as soon as a restructuring announcement comes through, they consider leaving, even if they and their team is not affected by it. And then you get a whole range of other sort of emotional responses. People have this thing called survivor syndrome, where they'll know colleagues are leaving, that teams are changing, they anticipate absorbing all of that additional responsibility and work, but they're also probably trying to support their colleagues emotionally whilst also working out what this means for them personally. So it's a pretty complex, unstable and emotional environment. And it creates a lot of uncertainty. People are going to ask, well, what got us to this point? And does leadership have a plan from here on in? So you can sort of see trust start falling away. And for everyone, it simply makes the job of focusing and still performing even harder to do. So it's quite complex, but lots of perfectly understandable reactions. And so for me, this is where communication and more structured communication directly to this group who you need to stay is what becomes really critical, actually. And if we go to the next slide, Emma, what we'll often see during redundancies and restructures. So you have this imperative that communication's never been more important at this time. And then, of course, what we see is leaders become extremely cautious in their communication. They're concerned about the legal risk, of course, and they should be. They're concerned about saying things that will change later on. There's this other thing, though. They feel worried about looking crass by talking about the brighter future and vision that is going to be brought about by this transformation and change. And they quite often don't want to say anything about that because a number of people are currently going through this process. They almost get over emotional about that, or over empathetic, if you like, about that said. And the negative side of that is communication becomes completely limited. So it becomes only the minimum required process updates. And then your default message is, we can't say anything at all. And, that leads to silence. It leads to a vacuum. And as we know, WhatsApp abhors a vacuum, as do all other internal comms channels. Slack is particularly nefarious in this regard. So what happens is the rumor mill starts when your communication stops, and everyone is an expert on what happens next. Employees still have all the same questions. They still want to know, will there be further rounds? What's the vision? Where's my part in it? But the people now answering those questions are not you as a team or a leadership. It is colleagues who are coming up with whatever answers they think are correct. And that has real unforeseen and quite damaging consequences if you leave it completely unchecked. And I've been in so many scenarios where a leader will come onto a town hall during this kind of a process, and their whole objective is to get out of the town hall unscathed, get away as quickly as possible, not actually have dialogue with the employees who are asking questions. If you just start deflecting everything, trust gets reduced even further, and you're just fueling the rumor mill. And really key point for all leaders and HR people, you're not in the rumor mill. You're not on their WhatsApp chats and their Slack groups, but everyone else is. So you may feel that you're still in control, but you're only in control of what you can see. And actually what you can't see is what's really affecting the rest of the organization, which is what we always talk about when we're talking about culture. So it's like a water cooler effect on steroids, if you like. And let me just show you, I think, a few points on the next slide and final slide from me that I think are quite important. So it's the cost of you ceding that control. And it shows up in sort of four really, really important ways that I just thought it would be key to substantiate for you. So The first is key person flight risk. So lots of people aren't prepared to wait and see what happens after the program. You get that default leader response of, I can't communicate anything until this is done. But people want to know something before this is done. And so people will start leaving, and the people who leave will not be your poor performers. So that idea that some managers have of it's okay because we'll get rid of the ones that we want to get rid of anyway, crass phrase, I appreciate, but that doesn't happen. So research from the Corporate Leadership Council actually showed that your top performers are 3 times more likely to leave during periods of uncertainty, and especially in how you respond to people. If you're on a group consultation and you treat people like they're not adults and you just back questions away, that's when all your department heads think, okay, maybe leadership hasn't got this after all, maybe I should be looking. And if they're worried about several rounds coming, some of them are thinking, I should go now, because by the time the second round or the third round comes, there might not be as many available jobs in the market. So actually, they tend to get ahead of it if you don't manage it very carefully. Second key point, which is linked to that, is a loss of trust in leadership. So if you're not communicating well, CIPD reports that employees who receive no explanation for decisions during restructuring are 3 times more likely to distrust leadership as a result. That's whether they stay or whether they go. But Gartner found that those who understand the rationale behind what the business is doing are 4 times more likely to recommit and really commit in the following year. And that's key because it leads to point 3, which is productivity. So productivity takes longer to recover if you don't do the comms part well. We know it inevitably dips during the consultation whilst everyone's worried and talking and all sorts, but it actually dips an additional 20% amongst remaining employees when communication is poor. Where it's clear, what you can see is organizations regain productivity 40% more quickly. And then a final concern, and it's tied into all of those 3 really, is that if you don't communicate well through a process, a real concern is the organization will never fully regain its footing. So again, from the CIPD, there's a really striking finding I can point to, which shows that 1 in 3 businesses that undergo poorly communicated restructures enter another redundancy cycle within 12 months. And it's this combination of never quite recovering on the productivity, some of your better people leaving, so now your business plan doesn't really work because now you've got the recruitment costs and you've got the additional break that all of that puts onto the organizational performance. And you've also then got the lack of trust. You're going to try to G everyone up after this process and get them focused on the new vision again. But if you've already lost their trust, it's harder for them to follow and harder for them to come with you. So we will talk now about, some of the things that you can and can't say, but really as you go into these processes, I think overlooking communication is an error, and overlooking communication to the people who are going to build the future business is an error that lots of people make.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think there is that tendency that less is more. I wonder if I could just put you on the spot and just sort of pick up on a couple of things that kind of occurred to me as you were talking. Often, and I absolutely agree with you, I think getting it right, the strategic message, oftentimes though, that strategic message is delegated to managers. So they are the ones who are at the front line, delivering the message, dealing with the questions, dealing with the team, and what that's going to look like in the future. So for leaders, for managers out there, if you like, the kind of the front line, they themselves can be feeling the way that you're saying, uncertain, distrustful. Maybe they might be impacted as well. So they're having to deliver the message, but as well being part of the message. So what support could maybe senior leadership, strategic support give to managers who are caught up in it personally?
Yeah.
And also the second point is that managers are, they are the ones that are being asked the questions and they don't always have the answer. And so it's very difficult from that trust perspective that they're saying, I don't know. And that's not a great look either. I just wonder on those 2 points, if you had any support that maybe you could give.
Yeah, so there's sort of the bigger picture thing is very much on make sure you've got a rationale for doing this and you've really thought it through. And there's a form of communication that you can say this is what's got us into this position and this is what will get us out of it. Because no one goes into this kind of a process unless they think the business will be better afterwards. So you do have some kind of a vision and some kind of rationale behind it. I think people tend to feel that they're meant to hide too much, even from the managers. And as a result, they just don't make the managers feel confident that there is a plan. And then when the managers are having those conversations with their people, they tend to default to that, putting their arm around them, treating them like they're their mate. Oh, don't worry, And so you end up with these sorts of factions. The little tip I would always give, this is my answer to almost every single question ever, Emma. It's to apply this little sort of design thinking principle of know, feel, do. So if you actually look at those two cohorts, let's say we take frontline workers and we take the managers responsible for managing a lot of this process, but who might also be affected by it. Ask yourself, what do they really need to know? How do you want them to feel? And what do you need them to do? And if you did that with managers, you start with, what do I need you to do during this process? You can answer that question. You then ask that really good question of, but how are they currently feeling? And how would I like them to feel? That then changes what you do as a leader. Because if you know that they're also feeling scared and apprehensive and more likely to side with their team, but you want them to feel confident and able to motivate people about the future, that then changes how you communicate with them, whether you bring them inside the circle or whether you leave them at arm's length, and everything that you then do during that process. Because in everything, managers being trained and skilled and experienced in all of this is almost the answer to everything when it comes to employee comms and culture. There's only a certain amount that can be done through official channels and from the central team. The rest of it, you are going to have to rely on person to person communication. So you kind of just, as you said rightly, you need to know where they are, what they know, how they feel, and make sure they're as prepared as can be. Because also, again, a lot of them are going to be in this audience that you want to stay. So they've got to know the journey you're going on in order to be able to explain it, but also for their own future within the business.
Thanks, Phil. Can I just input on one point that occurs to me there? And it applies to the senior leaders in the town halls, in my experience, as well as to the line managers. And it's to your point, how do you want them to feel? And what we advisors, what we don't want them to feel is like a rabbit trapped in the headlights. And that's quite a hard one to get away from sometimes, understandably so for them. So again, this is just a sort of a practical tip. Um, that if anyone doesn't feel confident answering a question on the spot, they can still reply afterwards, and that doesn't mean reply separately. They can include the town hall group or the audience in that question for transparency reasons and to show integrity. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. It can be clunky, but it's essentially about integrity, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. I completely agree. Because what you don't really want, and it's the worst thing in the world, is the town hall finishes and 30 seconds later there's an FAQ sent round, and you're like, well, they clearly weren't our questions then, were they? But flip that round. You already know what most of the questions are going to be. So the other tip I would give is practice them. Because it's so seldom that a leader goes into one of those consultation meetings having done a dress rehearsal with their team. Why not?
I could only echo that sentiment, and it's a very good point, and I think it's to the preparation piece, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. The devil of redundancy is always in the detail. Harry, the law is a wondrous thing, but can sometimes be a bit of a blunt instrument, can't it? And I think, when we think about communication and we think about, the need to, inform and consult, and the need to obviously retain and engage and motivate your remaining staff as well. Sometimes the law does not help in that. But I think before we come on to talk about some of the benefits of having, fixed and rigid processes that we have, obviously, particularly when we think about collective consultation, and some of the the negative impact that that can sometimes have, particularly as what as Phil has described. I think it's worth just kind of taking a little bit of step back and thinking about the backdrop of this conversation, and really, all eyes are on the 1st of January 2027. So Harry, just give us a quick recap of what changes we've seen in this area and what we can expect to see as we move forward into next year.
Thank you, Emma. So, I mean, the headlines are there on the slide, and the first the first two, if not the third, are quite game changing, really. So we have a reduction in the qualifying period that is required to claim unfair dismissal from 2 years to 6 months. And we have the removal of the compensation cap for unfair dismissal compensatory awards. That's the statutory maximum cap is going with effect from 1 January 2027. That's with effect from dismissals taking effect on or after 1 January 2027. Well, there's a few wrinkles around that, but I'm not going into that detail here. Um, and then, I mean, I think very on very similar in a very similar vein, the increase in the protective award claims, the maximum award that can be made is increasing from 90 days gross actual pay to 180 days gross actual pay per affected employee. Now, these are claims that are made for a non-compliance with the collective redundancy consultation obligations. And the headline here is that they are not compensatory. They're almost punitive in nature, the protective awards. That the tribunals tend to award towards the maximum end unless they can find good reason to reduce the award. So it's quite different from unfair dismissal compensation, which is there really for loss of earnings. And then we've got the introduction of a new organisation-wide threshold, which will be a new trigger for the collective consultation obligations to arise, and it'll sit alongside the current trigger, which is where an employer is proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees within a period of at the same establishment within a period of 90 days. But we don't know what that's going to be. It could be a percentage across the workforce. It could be something else. There's consultation ongoing. But really, in relation to what a lot of I'm going to be speaking about, it's going to be the first two, and they will impact on business risk appetite.
Absolutely. And the other point about the protective award is, of course, there is no service qualification for that. And also, it's that wider group, isn't it? When we think about collective consultation, we talk about the affected group, which actually can include the individuals who are remaining when we think about workload increases, added responsibility, etc. So some big changes that already sit on the current risks and rules that we have around unfair dismissal, protective awards, and collective consultation. So this is going to be an added layer of risk, and absolutely, Harry, as you say, planning and factoring in these additional costs. So as I said, this isn't a deep dive into redundancy, but I think it would be interesting to think about when we're talking about consultation and we're talking about communication. Let's have a little think about what we have to say in either a collective consultation or individual. Sometimes, when you've got a collective consultation period, you will have an individual consultation period running in parallel to that. Obviously, for smaller numbers, again, looking at the individual consultation. So, Harry, what do we have to say?
Well, very good question. I'm going to talk about what you have to say with a fundamental caveat that you don't, apart from the HR1 notification criminal law obligation, have to say anything. It
Absolutely.
is a business
Absolutely.
decision.
Absolutely. And remember those changes as well from December last year. Now we're all digital. So again, really look at timing on that. Because that's going to be crucial with the HR1 form now. So again, reach out, speak to us. We can give you some support and guidance on how, and in particular, really important when you fill that out.
Thank you, Emma. A good reminder on the digital rules. And, you know, bar the HR1 notification, we are essentially talking about civil law obligations here. So it is a commercial risk decision for the business. And businesses have taken a particular approach up until now, very understandably, particularly as regards the unfair dismissal risk, because we've had the cap and we currently still have the cap in place. But that is changing. So a quick dive. I'm going to look at individual consultation first. This is essentially about managing the unfair dismissal risk as opposed to the collective redundancy risk. And broadly speaking, you need to consult about the redundancy proposals when they are still at a formative stage. Now, consultation doesn't just mean information about a decision already taken. A lot of you will be very familiar with that. It's more than just giving warning about the redundancy proposals. It's about conscientious consideration of suggestions, comments from the employees at risk. And that consultation should be about avoiding redundancies, or indeed avoiding the individual's redundancies, and in particular addressing any suggestions put forward by the employees as regards alternatives, particularly alternative employment, and selection, in particular the proposed pool for selection, the proposed selection criteria. If there's not going to be any selection pool, then that is an issue for consultation. For example, where the selection pool is essentially just that one person who's been put at risk in what people often refer to as unique roles. And then if there is a selection pool, then you should be consulting about the provisional scoring. So give the employees an opportunity to challenge the provisional assessment. And then finally, really, it's the alternatives to redundancy and conscientious consideration of alternative employment.
Mm.
And so I'm not going to say much more about the individual consultation process in this section. I'm going to touch on some of these issues, and in particular, what consultation entails when I talk about saying too little. But when it comes to collective consultation, I would just highlight that this is as well as, not instead of, individual consultation. They're two separate processes. You can address some of the individual consultation obligations during the collective consultation process. And as I mentioned earlier, it arises whenever an employer is proposing to dismiss as redundant, and that carries a wider meaning than is commonly understood. 20 or more employees at one establishment within a period of 90 days. And then the consultation obligation is really to begin consultation in good time, but in any event, at least 45 days before the first dismissal takes effect, if you're proposing 100 or more dismissals within the 90-day period, or otherwise, if you're only proposing 20 or more dismissals, but under 100, then for at least 30 days before the first dismissal takes effect. And I would just emphasize there is no duty to consult for 30 days or 45 days. The duty is to start the consultation process at least 30 or 45 days before the first dismissal takes effect. And that process only starts running from the point in time when you notify the appropriate representatives, be they trade union reps or employee representatives. And if they're not trade union reps and you don't have standing employee representatives, then you will need to arrange elections. So that is sort of going to Phil's point on comms. That brings forward the date at which you will have to start comms, because you can't arrange elections for representatives for redundancy exercise without explaining to staff that there's going to be a redundancy exercise. Now, it's worth touching briefly on what the collective consultation process entails in terms of subject matter. Well, it's about avoiding dismissals. That's what you should be consulting about, reducing the number of dismissals and mitigating consequences. Now, the avoiding dismissals piece is a challenging piece because that can, in many cases, involve a duty to consult about the underlying business reasons for the redundancy. Not in absolutely every case, but in many cases. And just to give you a flavour of what else you should be consulting about, I'm going to run through the all-important section 188 prescribed notice to the employee reps or the trade union reps. And that must state the reasons for the proposals, numbers and descriptions of employees whom it is proposed you will dismiss as redundant, the total number of such employees at the establishment in question, method of selection, the method of carrying out dismissals, and the proposed method of calculating redundancy pay, and various details about agency workers. And once you sit back and recognize all of that detail and how prescribed the process is in certain respects, and that sits on top of the individual consultation process,
Absolutely.
you recognize that there is significant tension between the business needs that Phil is quite rightly highlighting and the legal risk associated with
Mm.
getting it wrong.
Absolutely. And the enormity of it, particularly when we're looking at those large scale redundancies and the timetabling and the preparation, as you've already mentioned, Harry, is absolutely crucial. So let's think about that consultation and let's just touch now on saying too little, because I think that's probably one of the biggest risk areas for employers in redundancies.
Yes. Well, I think a lot of this goes back to a point that Phil was touching on. It's this perennial problems of a manager not knowing what to say and so freezing or not wanting
Mm.
to own
Own it.
yeah,
Yeah.
basically not wanting to own it,
Mm.
and so not wanting to stand behind the business decision and being clear. And now, when I look down the list at on the slide there, a lot of that is stuff that can be dealt with via preparation in my book. And but I would also add that this is not all about line manager training or responsibility. This is partly about legal risk and strategy too, because there is quite a has been quite a well-established practice of what we call pre-selecting employees and then only putting at risk those who are provisionally selected. And the underlying business strategy is to avoid alienating those who you're not selecting and obviously retaining them. Now, that has always carried some risk in my view, but it has been quite a well-established practice. Um, in view of a Court of Appeal decision last year called Haycock and ADP RPO, I think there is a question now about whether that's dead in the water, particularly in view of the removal of the unfair dismissal compensatory award cap. And the reason for that is that it is, the Court of Appeal set out very clearly that it is bad practice. It's not necessarily fatal, it's not necessarily determinative of an unfair dismissal claim, but it is bad practice not to consult about scores prior to any decision to dismiss, and it's bad practice to conduct a scoring exercise before you start consultation. Now, in Haycock, and I'm not doing a deep dive on this, we just don't have time, but in Haycock, the employee was pooled for selection and he was not advised prior to dismissal about what his scores were, who had done the scoring, on the basis of what information the scoring had been done, or indeed that scoring was carried out before the consultation started. And in that case, there was a particularly thorough appeals process. But I would just highlight that it's not attractive if you're going to defend an unfair dismissal claim to be in the position that the employer was in Haycock. Yeah, I would say it's a risky approach to rely on rectifying mistakes at an appeal stage. They got away with it because they were very thorough at the appeal stage. So, taking that into account, you need to plan for the reality that if you want to manage the legal risk uh, and so comply, there will be uncertainty and instability among the employees that you want to retain.
A- Absolutely. And I just want to move on to talk about actually this point, because I think we've talked a lot about tension, actually.
Mm.
And I think we see in redundancy exercises, we see a tension between business need, financial confidentiality, sensitivities around information, and then we see, the people retaining good, retaining the staff that we want to moving forward, whilst complying with our legal obligations. And I just wonder, Harry, this point about is it a done deal actually, does come up quite a lot in, redundancy consultation exercises with employees just saying, well, it's just all, what we like to say a fait accompli. I wondered your
Yeah.
thoughts on this.
Well, my thoughts are that if you've got the backstop of redundance of an unfair dismissal cap and you know you're just going to settle them, then subject to the collective award risk,
Yes.
you can blur the lines on this and you can take some risk. But I think the world is changing,
Mm.
and I think there will be an expectation from board level for management to manage the unfair dismissal risk down a notch once the cap has gone. And so, these questions that come up time and again, can't we just let them know? They all know what's going on here. They just want to be told. They've been through this before. Why are they just waiting? Why are we just going through this process for the sake of process? And on that point about process for the sake of process, I would say, well, firstly, it's process for the sake of compliance, but secondly, I would say it's not process for the sake of passing time. It's, so often, there is a lot of focus on how long should we consult for, and that is relevant. But what's lost is the focus on what you're doing in that time. Because what a tribunal will look to is the substantive consultation that takes place during any given number of weeks. And I would say if there is a selection pool with selection scoring, I'd say it's very difficult to canter through everything properly in less than 3 weeks. But really focus on what's being done and not the time. And if you prepare and if you plan and if you timetable this, and if you timetable this with your comms specialist, then you can do this without leaving staff hanging in such a way that is unnecessarily destabilizing. And I'm not saying that there isn't going to be instability. Of course, there's going to be instability. It's the unnecessary instability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, going back to the point is what is the purpose of consultation? Why is the business, have going through this? And I think, almost kind of forget the process word. Why are we doing this? What do we want the impact of this to be? And also don't forget, there are obligations, and particularly obligations when we think of employees who are on certain types of family leave, with regards to suitable alternative employment. So again,
Yeah,
really thinking about how, as an organisation, we can engage with suitable alternative employment obligations. And of course, the wider the organisation, the bigger the organisation, that obligation is going to be, wider in terms of where the business is going to be looking. But I think engaging with that process, if you can offer some outplacement support, I think that's a really good way to, engage people, EAPs. There are going to be a lot of other issues that people will have now, financial, emotional. We can't, as managers, we can only deal with what we can deal with, control what we control. But again, being able to signpost individuals to support and doing that early. And again, remembering things like the discrimination risk as well, making sure that in your selection process that it is open, it is fair, it is transparent. And again, we're not using redundancies as an opportunity to get rid of or mask, other issues which basically have not been dealt with. A key example there will be poor performance. So there are other ways in which we can absolutely right engage with, the consultation exercise, and not see it as, well, we've stuck a consultation meeting in the diary. What are we all here to discuss? Make sure your managers go in with purpose. Why are we there? What are we gonna discuss?
well said on all of that. And just to touch on a specific point, Where I think the sands will shift potentially is this question of whether you say it's okay for staff to take time out to look for other work, because that has always carried a bit of a predetermination risk. It's a question about whether you're actually signalling there uh, that they are going, and that can be. That is, I am not saying at all that it is inconsistent with proper consultation. But I think businesses may take a more defensive and cautious approach to the unfair dismissal risk. And one other point, just on the com side, is, and Phil, I imagine, would be very alive to this, is that if you're going to do a voluntary redundancy process, then you will want to retain control over who is going. And so you will not just be offering voluntary redundancy to those who put themselves forward. What you'll be doing is asking anyone who wants to be considered to come to step forward. You'll be inviting volunteers, and then it's up to you to decide who you accept. And of course, if you retain control in that way, which is very advisable, but then you reject anyone who comes forward, um, then you risk alienating them. And I don't, Phil, I don't know what your experience is, but our experience is that inevitably you get some star performers who volunteer, and that can be challenging.
Yeah, no, completely. And it also goes to one of the key questions, which is, at the end of this, the people that you do want to stay, uh, they need to be able to answer the one question: do I still want to work for you? So it's everything that you've talked about, the balance of comms and emotion and looking after people is, but do I still want to work for you? And actually, there's another question you should ask yourself: if all of your key performers look to take voluntary redundancy, unless they're all, in the last few years or twilight of their career as they see it, if all your staff performers you're in a fintech and they're all in their 20s and they're all asking to leave, you might have a deeper cultural issue here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Sound advice. Let's bring it all together. Harry, tips before Phil, we get you to kind of close with your final thoughts.
Well, I think just on tips, I would say so far we've been talking a lot about the legals.
Mm,
In terms of compliance, there is obviously the separate question of is the business going to cough up to try and manage this risk with a severance process alongside it? My observations on that are, well, firstly, um, I think a lot of businesses will still want to take that approach, but they must be alive to the risk that employees will demand potentially quite a lot more than they used to, because there needs to be an incentive, and that incentive is potentially going up a notch in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence because the cap's gone. Um, Otherwise, I think, looking at the slide there, I think my main tip is preparation, 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 and timetabling, and then
mm.
empowering your line managers um, in line with that preparation and that timeline, to refer back if they're unsure on anything, and then just let them know that these comms don't have to be in the meeting. We can refer back outside of the meeting. Um,
I, I think that's right. I think it's thinking about the different information channels. And I think we tend to focus more on, okay, how are we going to get the information to either the elected employees or how we're going to get the information to individual employees. We forget that actually managers need a line of communication as well. And also just another, and it's another legal point, just on the statutory redundancy pay point, even though we're seeing the reduction in the period of qualifying service to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, with the little wrinkles, obviously, that are nuanced in that. So get in touch to discuss. But the statutory redundancy pay is remaining at 2 years service on that one. Um,
on a detail point, Emma, can I just throw in on the severance strategy, that hand in hand with that is the retention strategy for those
mm,
staff you do need to do the critical projects, i.e., until a particular platform is closed down or switched off. And that retention strategy would ideally not be a moving feast during the process, because I mean I see this from time to time that businesses, they need someone, that person is absolutely crucial to the maintenance of a particular system or platform, and it's not ideal to be changing the retention period, and employees will speak about any retention payments, and employees will speak about severance payments. But just do your thinking and your planning ahead on that, and try and stick with it and be realistic.
I absolutely echo that. We can't keep people hanging on, because it's not fair to sort of anybody in that kind of situation.
And they won't sometimes.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. Um, Phil, being human, I think is probably another key takeaway.
I think so. I think one of the things also just listening on the timetabling. Um, Build a comms timetable, but make it realistic that people will actually think that you have listened and not just communicated. I think consultation can often feel like broadcast, and we've got this meeting in to tell you what we've done. People have to actually feel like the comms are going back up the chain, that you're considering them. And so when you put in a really strict timetable that clearly isn't enough time for senior managers to have gotten together and think about these alternatives and actually weigh up whether they are going to make any changes because of it, you undermine the entire thing, because you don't feel human, and people feel like the process is being done to them. And then you go back to your both of your points. Why are we even doing a consultation if you're not going to consult? So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And a
And
judge
feedback.
will expect to see
The
that
yeah.
too. If you're going to send a letter after a consultation meeting, do reflect back on the issues that are arising. And it can look good if a timetable changes.
mm,
And actually, one of the key legal takeaways is feedback. How has the organisation firstly asked for feedback and what it's done with that feedback as well? And it goes to the whole point about, is the consultation meaningful? And feedback is incredibly important in the collective, because the whole point of the information consultation is that you are, seeking views of, you're asking for feedback. So how you ask for it, but also how you deal with it is really important. And I've had situations where people have gone, oh, I've got the letter here, I'm going to hand it to them, and it's just like, it just looks terrible.
yeah.
So
And
I
it's
think,
also, I was going to
yeah,
say, Emma,
you're
it's
right.
also terrible within a lot of industries. They're not that big. Lots of industries are really not that big. And so the people that
Mm,
are leaving you will leave with uh, an opinion of the reputation that will run like wildfire through LinkedIn and everything else. And one of the important things is that you make sure that even those that do leave with some sort of good grace. They feel like they've been treated fairly, because that will pay you back in time.
mm.
And I think looking at redundancy as a very short term thing is probably also an error. There's a long term reputational risk in how you treat people who are leaving as well as those who are staying.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. I'm going to close on that point because I think that just sums it up fantastically well. Compliance, absolutely, but don't forget communication, and don't forget that retention, how we want our employees to stay and be engaged and be productive, but also how we want to manage that offboarding process as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. Here are our contact details. I will be sending this out. So again, please do reach out to myself, to Harry, or to Phil if you want to find out more about communication and how Phil can help with that strategic support, particularly when new leaders come into an organisation, but obviously kind of delivering on that message. Always explain the why. Again, the Employment Rights Act really is the gift that keeps on giving. So again, if we can help and support, whether it's with litigation, preventative duty is coming, changing from October. So again, I'm doing lots and lots of work with organisations on risk assessments, training for employees, managers and senior exec boards. And I'm doing lots of updates as well for senior execs on the ERA, particularly around what it's going to mean for their business. Remember, we've got that window, that autumn window, but it's going to go very, very quickly. We're already in June, my goodness me. So again, reach out if we can help and support with all of that. So thank you so much for joining myself, Harry and Phil today. And I really hope that we will see you on next month's webinar, which will be a summer roundup. And I hope to see you at one of our training courses as well. So thank you very much. Bye bye.